I am going to read a book now called The Ancient Mystical White Brotherhood. This is the Melchizedek series. Biography of Reverend George Graham Price, whose spiritual name was Frater Achad. Reverend George G. Price came into our lives in the early fall of 1953 after a senior couple from Gary, Indiana, Natasha and George Greenlee, recently married, had spent most of 2 years traveling across the country looking for a truly high-quality metaphysical teacher. There were a number of fine men available publicly, but for some indefinite reason, none were quite who or what they seemed to be searching for. A friend announced over dinner, "Dear, I've just heard of the perfect teacher for you. His name is, oh, heck, I promised that I wouldn't tell anyone about him. He has retired completely from the public. I guess I shouldn't have mentioned him." However, before the evening was over, Mrs. Greenlee had the teacher's name and telephone number safely in her purse. A few days later, the Greenlees decided to call the teacher to make an appointment. The response was that he had withdrawn from the public permanently. When they asked about access to his wonderful philosophy, of which they'd heard, he replied that he had a student who had a public classes on the subject at the South Bend YMCA, Sunday mornings and Thursday evenings, to which they would be most welcome. Thursday evening found them at the appointed place a half an hour early, waiting expectantly. Mrs. Greenlee fretted, "What will I say when he asks who told us of them? I promised Ruth not to reveal her identity." Her husband calmly said, "Just leave it to me." Finally, the elevator stopped at that floor, and an elderly, stooped gentleman walked out with a young, vibrant, red-haired man. Suddenly a voice called out, "How did you find us? We had despaired of ever seeing you." The couple looked up and down the hall. There was still only the four there. They asked, "Who do you mean, us?" as the gentleman approached and replied, "Yes, of course, you two." The Greenlee couple introduced themselves to the teacher, Reverend George Graham Price, and his student, Eugene Lockhart. When asked again, "How did you find us? Who told you where we were?" Mr. Greenlee looked them sternly in the eye, replying, "If you can't tell us that, you aren't what we are looking for, and you'll never see us again." The laughing reply was, "I see the name Ruth in the arch over your heads." It was the name of the woman friend. That reply was the least remarkable of the accomplishments of Reverend Price, which we were to enjoy in the following 6 years of his life. Jean, it developed later, was seriously ill with diabetics. He, too, was a fountain of wonderful information, but he had an uncontrollable sweet tooth and serious diabetics that, at that time, was not easily medicated. He only lived a couple of years more. They both soon moved into the Greenlee home, and the wonderful lessons that came through George Price quickly attracted a fascinating and loyal group. While he was a highly educated and well-read man, and we got to know him personally very well, most of the material which came through him could not have been filtered through his consciousness. It was truly channeling of the highest quality. We later learned that a dear personal friend of Mr. Greenlee's was framed and went to the penitentiary in the fraud and financial flap that surrounded the I Am group of the Ballards in Chicago some time earlier. Therefore, a high-quality and clear channel was the only teacher of choice desired by Mr. Greenlee. He had lost a lot of money to the sheer greed of someone in the Chicago group and wasn't ready to allow that to happen again. Reverend Price was born in Chicago, Illinois in March of 1889 to circus performer parents. At an early age, he was telling people what was going to happen to them with startling accuracy, much to the deep chagrin of his devout Catholic parents. When he was 7, they sent him to a Jesuit boarding school with instructions to the fathers there to please exorcise him of these weird and blasphemous talents. However, the spiritual material that came through him was so interesting and fine that it caught the attention of 2 priests, who then, contrarily, took him under their wing and protected him and his talents. As he later declared, they really were responsible for the better development of my channeling abilities. He went on through Jesuit schools, through the priesthood, up to the time of graduation, it is said to the day of graduation, when he did not appear for his diploma and never did pick it up. Later he did complete his ministerial studies at the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago and became an ordained minister. He joined the Salvation Army for a short time, but a short-lived marriage did little to keep him there. While he dearly loved the ministry, teaching, counseling, and channeling to help people, his accuracy invariably attracted a substantial group who were more interested in questions of this sort: who will win in the 5th at Santa Anita, and is my sweetheart true to me? Since being a minister was a poorly paid position, and the concentration of many of his followers was strictly commercial and mundane, not spiritual, he would give it up and go into business. Several times he became quite wealthy, complete with chauffeur and many other creature comforts. Then his first love, spiritual teaching, looked better than ever, especially since he could now finance the church himself and hopefully attract a more spiritual group around him. Then again, discouraged and low on funds, he'd go back into the business world. At other times, in his desire to find the best way to help people in need, he was a male nurse in a leper colony. He also spent a short time with the spiritualist group at Lilydale. When Detroit was suffering from a rash of fake psychics, he helped the FBI in their investigations to weed out the unscrupulous. In a most astonishing case of conscious channeling, he helped one of our friends who, through fire and the resulting financial complications, had a tremendous business loss for himself and his investors. Consciously, Reverend Price first went through a list of 6 to 8 subsequent offers from across the country, which had dead-ended and further upset and confused the friend and his sense of business direction. Reverend Price painted each one in incredible and complete details. He ticked them off without one question to prompt him. Our friend turned to me and accused me of telling Reverend Price of them. I laughed and said I heard from his wife only of the first case. His jaw dropped. "You are right. I stopped telling her about everyone because she got more upset than I did with each subsequent fiasco." Finally, in his 60s, Reverend Price retired from the public in all ways, except for a very few faithful old students who had become widely scattered over the years. He was living with his student Jean Lockhart in South Bend, Indiana, when the Greenlees discovered him. After a few meetings with the Greenlees and being thoroughly impressed with their deep spiritual purity and intent, he announced, "I will hold back nothing from you. I will help you in every way that I can." He came out of full retirement to bless us all with many of these lessons during the last 6 years of his life. It was a glorious and wonderful time for this group, a number of whom traveled 50 to 150 miles for the regular meetings. Another couple came 300 miles for stays of up to 10 days. And one enthusiastic member came from as far away as Anchorage to stay for months on end. It was always the desire of Reverend Price to pass away at Christmas time. In December of 1995, he visited one of his students, James Mack, and his family in South Bend, Indiana. As he was preparing for bed on the evening of the 22nd, he fell and suffered a fatal concussion. The channel's baptismal name was George Graham Price. He was a quiet, humble, but engaging mystic who won the love and respect of those who crossed his path in life.